So we've got a right-angled triangle, and in this question we have one side given, an angle, and we need to find out a side. The sides of interest are the opposite and hypotenuse, so this has to be a sine question. And sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Opposite is hyp times the sine of the angle, and the hypotenuse is the opposite divided by the sine of the angle. So we use opposite equals the hypotenuse times the sine of the angle. We've still got the opposite and hypotenuse in question, so this is still a sine question. But we're finding the hypotenuse now. The hypotenuse is the opposite side divided by the sine of the angle. There's a little bit of rounding involved so that the video looked better. But if you use the full amount of decimal places, you'll get 100 as this answer. Now we've got the opposite and hypotenuse, but we're asked to find the angle. And if sine is opposite over hypotenuse, then the angle is inverse sine or shift sine of opposite over hypotenuse. So the angle theta or x, whatever you want to call it, is sine to the minus 1 of the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. So to get sine to the minus 1, you press shift and then sine. This must be a cosine or cos question because the sides of interest are the adjacent and hypotenuse. We're trying to find the adjacent side because that's where the question mark is. So the adjacent is the hypotenuse times the cosine of the angle. In the calculator, you can just write 100 cos instead of 100 times cos. Now we're trying to find the hypotenuse having been given the adjacent side, so this is still a cosine question. And the hypotenuse is the adjacent divided by the cosine of the angle. And if I hadn't rounded the numbers in the calculator, that would show 100 meters for the hypotenuse as it was earlier. Now we're still interested in the adjacent and the hypotenuse, so this is still a cos question, but we're finding the angle, so it's going to be inverse cos. It's always an inverse trig function to find an angle. So the angle is cos to the minus 1 or shift cos of the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. Now the sides of interest are opposite and adjacent, so this has to be a tan or tangent question. Tan is opposite over adjacent. Opposite equals the adjacent times the tan of the angle. And the adjacent equals the opposite divided by the tan of the angle. Opposite equals the adjacent times the tan of the angle. Make sure your calculator is in degrees mode. Now we're looking for the adjacent side when we know the opposite, so this is still a tan question. So the adjacent is the opposite side divided by the tan of the angle. And if I hadn't rounded the 214.45, that would show 100. Finally, the tan question, because we're given the opposite and adjacent and we're trying to find the angle. So the tan of the angle is opposite over adjacent, so the angle itself is tan to the -1 or shift tan or inverse tan of opposite over adjacent. So that shows the angle as 65 degrees as we thought.